Let me bring this down a bit. It's way up there, isn't it? Okay, we are reading Winn-Dixie. We are on chapter 5. Winn-Dixie couldn't stand to be left alone. We found that out real quick. If me and the preacher went off and left him by himself in the trailer, he pulled all the cushions off the couch and all the toilet paper off of the roll. So we started tying him up outside with the rope when we left. That didn't work either. Winn-Dixie howled until Samuel, Miss Detweiler's dog, started howling too. It was exactly the kind of noise that people in an all adult trailer park do not like to hear. He just doesn't want to be left alone, I told the preacher. That's all. Let's take him with us. I could understand the way Winn-Dixie felt. Getting left behind probably made his heart feel empty. After a while, the preacher gave in, and everywhere we went, we took Winn-Dixie, even to church. The Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi isn't a regular-looking church. The building used to be a Pick It Quick store, and when you walk in the front door, the first thing you see is the Pick It Quick motto. It's written on the floor in little tiny red tiles that make great big letters saying, "Pick, pick, pick, quick, quick, quick." The preacher tried painting over those tiles, but the letters wouldn't stay covered up, and so the preacher had just given up and let it be. The other thing about the Open Arms is that it's different from any other church, is that there aren't any pews. People bring in their own fold-up chairs and their lawn chairs, and so sometimes it looks more like the congregation is watching a parade or sitting at a barbecue instead of being at a church. It's kind of a strange church, and I thought Winn-Dixie would fit right in. But the first time we brought Winn-Dixie to the Open Arms, the preacher tied him outside the front door. "Why did we bring him all the way here just to tie him up?" I asked the preacher. "Because dogs don't belong in church, Opal," the preacher said. "That's why." He tied Winn-Dixie up to a tree, and there was lots of and said how there was lots of shade for him, and that ought to work out real good. Well, it didn't. The service started, and there was some singing and some sharing and some praying. And when the preacher started preaching, and he wasn't but 2 or 3 words into the sermon, when there was a terrible howl from outside. The preacher tried to ignore it. "Today," he said. "Aroo," said Winn-Dixie. "Please," said the preacher. "Aroo," said Winn-Dixie. "Friends," said the preacher. "Arp, arp," wailed Winn-Dixie. Everyone turned in their lawn chairs and their fold-up chairs, and they looked at one another. "Opal," said the preacher. "Oh," said Winn-Dixie. "Yes, sir," I said. "Go get that dog," he yelled. "Yes, sir," I yelled back. I went outside and I untied Winn-Dixie and brought him inside, and he sat down beside me and smiled up at the preacher. And the preacher couldn't help it. He smiled back. Winn-Dixie had that effect on people. And so the preacher started in preaching again. Winn-Dixie sat there listening to it, wiggling his ears this way and that, trying to catch all of the words. And everything would have been all right, except that mouse ran across the floor. The Open Arms had mice. They were there from when it was a Pick It Quick, and there were lots of good things to eat in the building. And when the Pick It Quick became the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi, the mice stayed around to eat all of the leftover crumbs from the potluck supper. The preacher kept on saying he was going to have to do something about them, but he never did. Because the truth is, he couldn't stand the thought of hurting anything, even a mouse. Well, Winn-Dixie saw that mouse, and he was up and after him. One minute everything was quiet and serious, and the preacher was going on and on and on, and the next minute, Winn-Dixie looked like a furry bullet shooting across the building, chasing that mouse. He was barking, and his feet were skidding all over the polished picket floor, and people were clapping and hollering and pointing. They really went wild when Winn-Dixie actually caught the mouse. "I've never seen in my life a dog catch a mouse," said Mrs. Mordley. She was sitting next to me. "He's a special dog," I told her. "I imagine so," she said back. Winn-Dixie stood there in front of the whole congregation, wagging his tail and holding the mouse real careful in his mouth, holding on to him tight, but not squishing him. "I believe that mutt has got some retriever in him," said somebody behind me. "That's a hunting dog." Winn-Dixie took the mouse over to the preacher and dropped it at his feet. And when the mouse tried to get away, Winn-Dixie put his paw right on the mouse's tail. And then he smiled up at the preacher. He showed him all of his teeth. The preacher looked down at the mouse, and he looked at Winn-Dixie, and he looked at me, and he rubbed his nose. It got real quiet in the Pick It Quick. "Let us pray," the preacher said finally, "for this mouse." And everybody started laughing and clapping. The preacher picked the mouse up by the tail and walked and threw it out the front door of the picket quick, and everybody applauded again. And then he came back and we all prayed together. I prayed for my mama. I told God how much she would have enjoyed hearing the story of Winn-Dixie catching that mouse. It would have made her laugh. I asked God if maybe I could be the one to tell her that story someday. And then I talked to God about how I was lonely in Naomi because I didn't know there were many kids, only the ones from the church. And there weren't that many kids at the open arms, just Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry, two brothers that weren't twins, but who looked like they were. And Amanda Wilkerson, whose face was always pinched up like she was smelling something really bad. And Sweetie Pie Thomas, who was only 5 years old and still mostly a baby. And none of them wanted to be my friend anyway, because they probably thought I'd tell on them to the preacher for every little thing they did wrong, and that they would get in trouble with God and with their parents. So I told God that I was lonely, even having Winn-Dixie. And finally, I prayed for the mouse, like the preacher suggested. I prayed that he didn't get hurt when he went flying out the door of the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. I prayed that he landed on a nice, soft patch of grass. Chapter 6. I spent a lot of time that summer at the Herman W. Block Memorial Library. The Herman W. Block Memorial Library sounds like it would be a big, fancy place, but it's not. It's just a little old house full of books and Miss Fanny. Miss Fanny Block is in charge of all of them. She is very small, a very old woman with short gray hair. She was the first friend I made in Naomi. It all started with Winn-Dixie not liking it when I went into the library, because he couldn't go inside too. But I showed him how he could stand up on his hind legs and look in the window and see me in there selecting my books, and he was okay, as long as he could see me. But the thing was, the first time Miss Fanny Block saw Winn-Dixie standing on his hind legs like that, looking in the window, she didn't think he was a dog. She thought he was a bear. This is what happened. I was picking out my books, kind of humming to myself, and all of a sudden there was this loud and scary scream. I went running up the front steps of the library, and there was Mrs. Fanny Block sitting on the floor behind her desk. "Miss Franny," I said, "are you all right?" "A bear," she said. "A bear?" I asked. "He has come back," she said. "He has?" I asked. "Where is he?" "Out there," she said, and she raised a finger and pointed at Winn-Dixie standing up on his hind legs, looking in the window for me. "Miss Fanny Block," I said, "that is not a bear. That's a dog. That's my dog, Winn-Dixie." "Are you positive?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," I told her. "I'm positive. He's my dog. I would know him anywhere." Miss Fanny sat there trembling and shaking. "Come on," I said. "Let me help you up. It's okay." I stuck out my hand, and Miss Fanny took hold of it and pulled her up off the floor. She didn't weigh hardly anything at all. Once she was standing on her feet, she started acting all embarrassed, saying how I must think she was a silly old lady mistaking a dog for a bear, but that she had a bad experience with the bear coming into the Herman W. Block Memorial Library a long time ago, and she had never quite gotten over it. "When did that happen?" I asked her. "Well," said Miss Franny, "it was a very long story." "That's okay," I told her. "I am like my mamma in that I like to be told stories. But before you start telling it, can Winn-Dixie come in and listen too? He gets lonely without me." "Well, I don't know," said Miss Fanny. "Dogs are not allowed in the Herman W. Block Memorial Library." "He'll be good," I told her. "He's a dog who goes to church." And before she could say yes or no, I went outside and got Winn-Dixie, and he came right in and lay down with a humph and a sigh right at Miss Franny's feet. She looked down at him and said, "He most certainly is a large dog." "Yes, ma'am," I told her. "He has a large heart, too." "Well," Miss Franny said. She bent over and gave Winn-Dixie a pat on the head, and Winn-Dixie wagged his tail back and forth and shuffled his nose on her old lady feet. "Let me get a chair and sit down so I can tell this story properly." Chapter 7. Back when Florida was wild, when it consisted of nothing but palmetto trees and mosquitoes so big they could fly away with you, Miss Fanny Block started in, "I was just a little girl, no bigger than my father, Herman W. Block. Told me, no bigger than you. My father, Herman W. Block, told me that I could have had anything I wanted for my birthday, anything at all." Miss Franny looked around the library, and she leaned in close. "I don't want to appear prideful," she said, "but my daddy was a very rich man. A very, very rich man. She nodded, and then she leaned back and said, "And when I was a little girl, I was a little girl who loved to read. So I said to him, 'Daddy, I would most certainly love to have a library for my birthday. A small little library would be wonderful.'" "You asked for a whole library?" "A small one," Miss Franny nodded. "I wanted a little house full of nothing but books, and I wanted to share them too. And I got my wish. My father built me this house, the very one we are sitting in right now, and at a very young age I became librarian." "Yes, ma'am." "What about the bear?" I asked. "Did I mention that Florida was wild in those days?" Miss Fanny Brock said. Franny Block said. "Uh-huh, you did. It was wild. There were wild men and wild women and wild animals." "Like bears?" "Yes, ma'am, that's right. Now, I have to tell you, I was a little Miss Know-it-all. I was a Miss Smarty Pants with my library full of books. Oh, yes, ma'am. I thought I knew the answers to everything. Well, one hot Thursday I was sitting in my library with all of the doors and the windows open and my nose stuck in a book when a shadow crossed the desk. And without looking up, yes, ma'am, without even looking up, I said, 'Is there a book I can help you find?' Well, there was no answer, and I thought it might have been a wild man or a wild woman scared of all the books and afraid to speak up. But then I became very aware of a peculiar smell, a very strong smell. I raised my eyes slowly, and standing right in front of me was a bear. Yes, ma'am, a very large bear." "How big?" I asked. "Oh, well," said Miss Franny, "perhaps 3 times the size of your dog." "Oh, then what happened?" I asked her. "Well," said Miss Franny, "I looked at him and he looked at me. He put his big nose up in the air and sniffed, as if he was trying to decide if a little Miss Know-it-all librarian was what he was in the mood to eat. And I sat there, and then I thought, well, if this bear intends to eat me, I am not going to let it happen without a fight. No, ma'am." So very slowly and very carefully, I raised up the book that I was reading. "What book was that?" I asked. Why, it was War and Peace, a very large book. It was a bug. I raised it up slowly, and then I aimed it carefully, and I threw it right at the bear, and I screamed, "Be gone!" And do you know what? "No, ma'am," I said. "He went. But this is what I will never forget. He took the book with him." "Nuh-uh," I said. "Yes, ma'am," said Miss Franny. "He snatched it up and ran." "Did he ever come back?" I asked. "No, I never saw him again. Well, the men in town used to tease me about it. They used to say, 'Miss Franny, we saw that bear of yours out in the woods today. He was reading that book, and all he said it was good, and would it be all right if he kept it for just another week?'" "Yes, ma'am, they did tease me about it," she sighed. "I imagine I'm the only one left from those days. Imagine I'm the only one that even recalls that bear. All my friends, everyone I knew when I was young, they are all dead and gone." She sighed again. She looked sad and old and wrinkled. It was the same way I felt sometimes being friendless in a new town and not having Mamma to comfort me. I sighed too. Winn-Dixie raised his head off his paws and looked back and forth between me and Miss Franny. He sat up and showed Miss Franny his teeth. "Well, now, look at that," she said. "That dog is smiling at me." "It's a talent of his," I told her. "Oh, it's a fine talent," Miss Franny said. "A very fine talent." And she smiled back at Winn-Dixie. "We could be friends," I said to Miss Franny. "I mean, you and me and Winn-Dixie, we could all be friends." Miss Franny smiled even bigger. "Why, that would be grand," she said. "Just grand." And right at that moment, right when the 3 of us had decided to be friends, who should come marching into the Herman W. Block Memorial Library but old pinch-face Amanda Wilkerson. She walked right up to Miss Franny's desk and said, "I finished Johnny Tremaine and I enjoyed it very much. I would like something even more difficult to read now because I am an advanced reader." "Yes, dear, I know," said Miss Franny, and she got up out of her chair. Amanda pretended like I wasn't even there. She stared right past me. "Are dogs allowed in the library?" she asked Miss Franny as they walked away. "Certain ones," said Miss Franny, "a select few." And then she turned around and winked at me, and I smiled back. I had just made my first friend in Naomi, and nobody was going to mess that up for me, not even the old pinched-faced Amanda Wilkerson. And that's the end of chapter 7. See if I can find the stop button on here. Uh-oh. This might take a minute. It's very sunny out here. Found it.